welcome to DEFCON 3. I'm KT McFarland. Officials right now are trying to determine what connection the Islamist terrorists who attacked Charlie Hebdo magazine have to the extremist groups abroad, like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. This attack in Paris, though, it doesn't come as a big surprise because the jihadist threat in France and other parts of Europe has been there for some time. Well, joining us to discuss are Stratfor's Fred Burton and Foreign Policy Initiative's David Adesnik. Welcome, gentlemen. Let me turn first to you, David. What is the connection between what we saw in Paris and Al-Qaeda and ISIS?
Well, first of all, KT, thank you for having me. And to answer your question, it's that these are two faces of precisely the same conflict and the same threat. It's not that there's one terrorist threat to Europe or other Western places and then a different threat that ISIS and other groups present in the Middle East. It's two faces of the same threat. And if we don't get serious about what we're doing in the Middle East, we won't be able to prevent that threat from causing damage at home.
So how do we track people who are making that connection in Europe?
Well, part of it is tracking the individuals, and what's interesting, perhaps a little disconcerting here, is that the brothers who were the gunmen in the French attack were known to French authorities, but who nonetheless weren't able to track them to the point of the attack. And there seems to be evidence that they fought in Syria as part of the jihad there and then returned and with sufficient training to mount an attack of this magnitude.
Fred, let me turn to you. How do we know who these people are? I mean, how are we tracking them? How are we able, or the French officials, how are they able to know, okay, these guys, they probably traveled to Syria, they probably fought for ISIS, now they're back trying to do something in Paris. How do we sort of winnow them out from the crowd?
That's the daunting challenge, KT. I'm sad to say there's simply too many jihadis and not enough counterterrorism agents or cops to surveil them. And then you put the porous borders in play where you can have operatives that can move from country to country. That's the real rub. And that's why this is probably the biggest challenge facing counterterrorism agents going forward over the next 10 years.
Let me turn to you, David. We've seen in the last several years these sort of one-off things. I mean, the president's called them workplace violence or senseless violence, but it's an individual who's maybe mentally challenged in some way or another, who's got problems of his own prior to, but goes on to jihadi websites, gets radicalized, and then goes out and does something, tries to run a car into somebody, tries to shoot somebody, but it's not really a planned operation. He's not really trained. And then what we saw in Paris was a very different thing. It was people who were trained. As one commentator said, these are men who have killed before. How do we find the difference between the two, and how do you prevent? Is it a different way of dealing with the two groups?
Absolutely, I think. And you point to a crucial difference, that the sort of lone wolf attackers in Canada, Australia, and elsewhere, it's harder to know when they'll emerge, when they might hit a tipping point in their personal stability, whereas the others are part of organized efforts, and it's the more traditional aspects of intelligence. We need to ensure we have sufficient funding. And also it points to some controversial issues, such as the question of the role of NSA surveillance. That has been questioned as something that may infringe too much on our own freedom of speech, but I think this attack underlined in a somewhat ironic manner that the real threat to freedom of speech are the terrorists, that they are murdering cartoonists and journalists. And we have to remember that we should always be vigilant and not let the government have too much power, but we do need to give it the tools to prevent the real threats to freedom of speech.
You know, Fred, let me turn to you. What it sounds like from what David has said is that there is a connection between these two kinds of terrorists, and that is that they all get radicalized one way or another. They intersect in the Internet. Is there a way of using either social media or tracking over the Internet or people's cell phone or conversations that way, or their Internet connections? Is there a way of finding them? Do they leave footprints when they go to these places, and can we track those footprints down to the terrorists?
We certainly can, KT. It's been my experience as a former agent that usually attacks go forward and are carried out due to a lack of human intelligence or a lack of tactical analysis, meaning you don't have the sources to tell you exactly what's going on, and or you can't connect the dots. And that was the failure point in pretty much every terrorist attack I ever investigated. And I think, to David's point earlier, that these are individuals that were known to the French intelligence service. So how do you keep track of individuals like that that are predisposed towards this activity? And it takes a robust human intelligence collection effort, which nobody likes to talk about. Basically, that's snitches or spies in the organizations. And it also takes very good analysts to be able to connect those dots.
David, do we have to worry about this at home, in the United States, in the homeland? Is this the sort of attack we could see in America?
Yes. So far, we're fortunate in the sense that there are fewer Americans who have gone to fight in the Middle East for jihadi organizations as compared to Frenchmen or Britons. Actually, the British have even more than the French. There's an estimate of 3,000 Britons who have gone. The French number is somewhat lower, perhaps over 1,000. But, it may only be a matter of time. We know we've intercepted Americans going to join the Somali terrorist organization and al-Qaeda affiliate, al-Shabaab. So the question is, if these people can come back into the country without raising too much of an alarm, because they have American passports or because they have green cards, then we have to step up our ability to find those people, even if they have that advantage on their side.
Fred, I'm going to give you the last word. How do we protect ourselves, our law enforcement, and our civilian population from this?
Well, I think it takes a very robust partnership. If you look at the location that was hit, they were on an al-Qaeda hit list. They had been in the gun sites before. They had been firebombed and literally driven out of their old building. These kinds of organizations need to take ownership of physical security measures. They need to work with the local cops. They need to ask for internal threat assessments. They have to have REACT plans. They have to have safe rooms. They literally need to know what to do if an active shooter comes into the workplace. And you don't find many companies or organizations or news outlets going through those kinds of steps today.
Well, that's pretty harrowing thought for all of us at home and abroad. Thanks, Fred. Thanks, David. And for more on this developing story, stay with FoxNews.com. I'm KT McFarland, and thank you for watching DEF CON 3.